Hey everyone and welcome back to my channel. I've had such a blast this October making videos based around horror films. Even though it was tough work sitting through some of the sequels, revisiting the Halloween franchise was a lot of fun, and being able to recommend some of my favorite underrated slashers was an absolute treat. If you're a big fan of the genre and haven't checked those out yet, I really recommend checking those videos out. That being said, most of those videos are for fans of horror, whether that be self-proclaimed horror buffs or those who casually enjoy a good spooky flick. But I thought a fun way to cap off October would be to make a video for those unfamiliar with the genre and looking to break into it. So if you or someone you know isn't a horror fan, this video is for all of you, as I will be giving you guys the 10 films I think are quintessential horror films that every fan of the genre or newcomers should check out. So with all of that out of the way, here are 10 films I consider to be required viewing to either get you into the genre or solidify your status as a true fan of scary movies. Let's get the obvious out of the way. My personal favorite horror film, and on any given day could be my answer for my favorite film period, my personal bias aside, John Carpenter's 1978 classic Halloween is, in my humble opinion, a perfect movie. The right director, the right script, the right music, the right cinematographer, and the absolute perfect time to be released. Credited as the film that unleashed the boom of slashers released throughout the 80s after massive success on a measly $300,000 budget, everything about this film just works. The level of suspense crafted by John Carpenter's brilliant direction, mixed with Dean Cundey's beautiful and haunting cinematography that makes you feel like Michael Myers is always lurking in the shadows, and an iconic and timeless score that even non-horror fans are most likely familiar with, all blending together to perfectly tell the story of what happens when true unfiltered evil in the shape of a man collides with an innocent, quiet suburban Illinois town. The gore and kills are pretty subdued and tame in comparison to today's standards, but the sheer suspense built up throughout the film that leads into an amazing and riveting climax adds a nice sense of setup and payoff. If you're trying to break into the horror genre, there's not a lot of better places to start than the one that contains the most iconic horror movie villain of all time. Released in 1974 and directed by Tobe Hooper, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the best films the genre has to offer, and one that I didn't really understand at first. When young, youthful 16-year-old former film student laid his eyes upon this film, I didn't really understand where all the praise and admiration came from. Several years later, and the stupidity of my high school brain slightly more developed, I fully understand and appreciate everything this movie has to offer. What Tobe Hooper was able to accomplish with an even smaller budget than the previously mentioned Halloween is kind of unfathomable. A simple story of a brother and sister along with 3 friends traveling to Texas to make sure their grandfather's grave wasn't destroyed, but opting to make a small pit stop at their grandfather's old farmhouse turns quickly into something straight out of a nightmare, as what they run into is the definition of chaos. Without spoiling too much about the film's plot, because again, this is a video for those who haven't seen these films, the horrors that await this unsuspecting group of friends is more sadistic and horrifying than any normal person could imagine. The film works so well because of how authentic and real it feels. For years, fans of the films have claimed that when watching, you feel as if you're watching a snuff film, like you're viewing something that you shouldn't be. The visuals in this movie look dingy and dirty in the best way possible, as you can almost smell the movie, and you feel as if the sweat beating off the characters is dripping right through the screen. If Halloween is the perfect representation of pure evil, then Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the perfect representation of insanity, as the last 20 minutes of this film devolves into complete and utter madness that by the time the screen cuts to black and the end credits roll, you feel just as traumatized as the characters. The only horror film on this list to really transcend the genre, and for that reason alone may be to this day the best movie in horror, The Exorcist. Released in 1973, written by William Peter Blatty and directed by William Friedkin, tells the story of a young priest struggling with his faith who must put aside his differences when called upon by a famous actress after her daughter has seemingly been possessed. Not only was this film extremely controversial at the time of its release due to its subject matter and the fact that a young girl is seen saying and doing the most demonic and insane things you can possibly imagine, but the film was also extremely well received, being the first film in the horror genre to be nominated for Best Picture, and anyone who follows the Oscars knows how much they hate horror films, making its nomination all that much more impressive. On top of containing some truly terrifying and bone-chilling scenes, what works so well about the film is the story and the characters. The way the plot unfolds and the depth that's added to the characters makes the film feel less like your generic scary film and more like a heartbreaking drama that just happens to contain demons and an exorcism. For starters, the lead of the film, Father Damien Karras, is an excellent protagonist, a priest having a crisis of faith and devastated by the recent passing of his mother, which he feels extreme amounts of guilt over, now must put this aside when a woman approaches him asking him him to perform an exorcism. Going off of that, the actress/mother Chris McNeil, played brilliantly by Ellen Burstyn, is also a great character. The film does such an excellent job of making you really feel for her character. Whereas a lot of films have a child get possessed and then immediately shit is hitting the fan, The Exorcist takes its time and really develops her character and relationship with her daughter, showcasing what this is doing to her mental and emotional state, so by the time she approaches a priest to perform an exorcism, it really feels like this is her last-ditch effort. All around, the film is kind of perfect. The direction is flawless, the performances are great across the board, and it contains a genuinely compelling story with interesting characters and well-written dialogue, a rarity for the genre. Also, who can forget the excellent theme featured in the movie, and also one of the best interpretations of a possession. While many horror fans would probably rather me put the sequel Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn in this slot, I think it's worth remembering that this is a list for people trying to get into the genre. And if that's the case, this little darling of indie filmmaking is one of the best. Released in 1981 and helmed by future Spider-Man director Sam Raimi, the film follows 5 friends heading up to a remote cabin in the woods for a little getaway. All seems well until sadistic and otherworldly evil is unleashed upon them and they must fight to survive the night. This film is perfect for new horror fans for a multitude of reasons. For starters, there's a lot of big budget horror, so being introduced to a smaller scale independent film like The Evil Dead is a great place to start with the genre. Despite it having a small budget and being independent, don't let that fool you for a second, as Sam Raimi is one of the most creative visual directors of all time. So even though there wasn't a lot of money behind this movie, the shots and camera work make it feel way more expensive than it actually is. Almost every other shot is a dolly zoom or crane shot, and the sheer energy of the camera and editing gives the film such a unique and distinct style to it. It also sort of is responsible for kickstarting the cliché cabin in the woods trope that we've seen done a dozen times since. Another reason besides it not being a sequel as to why I put this on the list over Evil Dead 2 is that this one is much more rooted in straight up horror than its sequel, which heads down a much more comedic route, which may make it the more entertaining of the two, but if we're going based off pure horror, Evil Dead 1 is truly terrifying. The cruel and psychotic Deadites are a great movie villain and super unique in not only the design but how they converse with our characters. Whereas in something like The Exorcist, the demon possessing Regan says foul things and tries to anger or upset people. The Deadites in Evil Ted are sort of just obnoxious assholes who get a kick out of tormenting and antagonizing. The tone, atmosphere, and brilliant special effects are just more icing on the cake, as Raimi's The Evil Dead is a true masterclass in not only unique horror, but also independent guerrilla-style filmmaking. It also has the introduction to one of the most iconic figures in horror ever, Ash Williams, played by Bruce Campbell. If you thought this list was just going to be horror movies from 40 years ago, sorry to disappoint, as I think there is plenty of great modern horror that should be essential viewing for any newcomer. That being said, it doesn't get much better than Ari Aster's 2018 psychological horror film, Hereditary. Starring the fantastic Toni Collette as the lead character, along with co-stars Gabriel Byrne, Alex Wolff, and Ann Dowd, the film follows Annie, played by Collette, after her mentally ill mother passes away. Reeling from the loss of her mother and the animosity amongst the family due to past issues, Annie begins experiencing weird and disturbing occurrences that only worsen as the film progresses. Similar to The Exorcist, this is another film that transcends the horror genre in my opinion, as not only is it intense and truly bone-chilling, especially in the last act of the film, but also does its due diligence in telling a well-crafted story with fleshed out and interesting characters, as it's not only Toni Collette's phenomenal and frankly award-worthy performance that is a huge driving force for the film's success, but also how her character is written. Whether it's tiny moments of her character mentioning she feels bad that she's not more upset about her mother's passing, or larger, more prominent moments like the infamous dinner scene, this film takes its time to really give us an authentic feeling protagonist with flaws and a great sense of humanity to them. The film serves as not only a great piece of horror with excellently crafted scary scenes, but operates simultaneously as a really great family drama about parenthood and also the grief process. It does an amazing job at portraying how loss and death can really affect a family on a core and structural level. Overall, guys, Hereditary is a fantastic modern horror film, and you should really check it out. Maybe watch it with the lights on, as you may not be able to sleep after. It may not have been the first, it may not even be the best, but to me, the most definitive slasher is and will always be Wes Craven's 1996 meta-horror film Scream. Originally titled Scary Movie, which would later be used as the title of the Wayans Brothers spoof movie, Scream tells the story of a series of grisly murders that plague the small Californian town of Woodsboro, following Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, and her group of friends, including Shaggy himself, Matthew Lillard. Like I said, this wasn't the first slasher, and I don't even think it's the best. However, I've always felt that the definitive slasher is Scream and not something like Halloween or Texas Chainsaw Massacre because of how perfectly Scream dissects not only horror, but specifically the slasher subgenre. The self-referential meta-horror elements mixed with Scream genuinely being an effective and scary slasher is what truly puts it a cut above the rest. I should preface this by saying, while I do consider this quintessential viewing for horror fans both new and old, you may get more out of this movie once you're a little more well-versed in the horror genre, especially slashers. However, even if you don't get the references made by the characters or quite understand how the meta-humor works, this is still an insanely effective horror film. The death scenes are iconic and memorable, and the constant guessing of who the killer is will never not be fun. The Ghostface costume and mask are excellent and to this day remains one of the most iconic masks in horror, and the use of a hunter's knife as opposed to something like Michael Myers' butcher knife is a nice variation of a classic slasher weapon. And as mentioned, the scenes in this film are surprisingly still effective nearly 30 years later. The opening scene of the film is still, in my opinion, the best opening scene to any horror film. Everything works about it. The kill itself, the sense of fear portrayed so excellently by Drew Barrymore, the music, the smoke filling the house, the parents arriving just as the kill is happening. So many great elements are included in this opening scene as to why it is probably the most iconic and best opening to a horror film. It's such a gut punch way to open your film, and a great cold open that hasn't been paralleled by any film in the franchise since. And to top it all off, you get Neve Campbell as Sidney Prescott, who is, in my humble opinion, the greatest scream queen of all time. I know, I said earlier that I didn't put Evil Dead 2 on here partially because it's a sequel. However, Dawn of the Dead is a sequel in really the name alone, as it is the successor to George A. Romero's 1968 classic Night of the Living Dead, but has no reoccurring characters and no real plot threads that carry over. All that is to say, I highly recommend Night of the Living Dead, and I personally prefer it over Dawn. But if I were to recommend what I think is a better introduction, Dawn may be the better of the two. A bigger budget, better special effects, more memorable characters, and to tie it all together, a plot that is oozing with incredible dialogue and underlying themes and messages of consumerism. Dawn of the Dead really sets itself apart from most other zombie films in the way that the zombies are still a threat, but that's ultimately not what the film is about. Yes, there's 4 characters holed up in a shopping mall avoiding the zombie apocalypse. However, the film is really telling this tragic and heartbreaking story of the world falling apart around them, yet these characters distract themselves with novelty items and all the luxuries that a mall would have to offer. The consumerism angle of the story really isolates Dawn of the Dead as a film trying to be more than a simple zombie flick, and the commentary on people using materialistic objects as a way to distract from what's going on around them really just puts this film over the top. However, don't let all the theme and message talk detract from this still being a horror film, as there's plenty of great sequences that are rooted in true horror. The opening sequence of the film is extremely chaotic and suspenseful, and what follows are plenty of horrifying scenes of zombies ripping people apart like string cheese. The gore and makeup effects are excellent, as Tom Savini, who's a legend in the special effects field, brings his talents to this film and puts them on full display. All in all, I may go on record and say this is the best zombie flick ever made. So if you're looking into getting into horror and want to see what many consider the creme de la creme of zombie flicks, you can't beat Dawn of the Dead. The Shining, a horror movie based off a Stephen King novel directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring acting legend Jack Nicholson. Do I even need to say more as to why you should watch this movie? I mean, what is there to say about The Shining that hasn't already been said? It's a perfect movie. I know I've said that a few times in this video, but guys, this is Stanley fucking Kubrick, the man who made 2001: A Space Odyssey making a horror film. I don't really even know what to say about this movie. People who haven't even seen it know of several scenes simply based off of cultural impact and other shows and films spoofing it. The story of Jack Torrance, who agrees to watch over the Overlook Hotel during their slow season while also bringing his wife and son Danny along with him, also he can get some peace and quiet and hopefully get some writing done. However, not much writing is accomplished as immediately weird and unsettling things begin happening all over the hotel. All the while, you as an audience member are forced to sit back and watch Jack Nicholson grow increasingly more and more unhinged. The film is riddled with incredible direction from Stanley Kubrick, strong cinematography, next-level performances, and a fantastic musical score that unnerves and unsettles right from the opening shot as we fly in on the Torrance family weaving their way through the mountains on their way to the Overlook Hotel. While King himself isn't a fan of the movie, weirdly enough, it has become a certified classic of the genre, with many considering it to be the best horror film of all time, and although it's not my favorite, I can't really argue. Iconic scenes, iconic director, iconic actor, and a timeless classic, every horror fan should see The Shining. So I was torn between two picks here, John Carpenter's 1984 classic The Thing, or Alien. So you can consider that statement as me recommending both films. However, if I had to pick one essential must-see, despite me preferring The Thing, I'd have to go with Alien as a great introduction for new horror fans. My reasoning for not including both is I want a bit of variety on this list, so having two sci-fi horror films that are both well known for their practical effects seems a tad redundant. I also already have one John Carpenter film on here, so for the sake of fairness, let's focus on Ridley Scott's 1979 masterpiece, Alien. Yes, you heard that right, folks, I said masterpiece, and I meant it. Many people, I think, immediately just toss this film into the sci-fi genre, and a lot of that may be the addition of James Cameron's sequel, Aliens, which is a much more action-oriented film. However, Alien 1979 is most definitely a horror film through and through that plays on fears that other films simply can't imagine. For starters, the film's tagline is absolutely perfect. No one can hear you scream in space, which just that statement alone is sending chills up my spine, as the added element of our characters being trapped in space creates a completely, and forgive the wordplay, but alien type of fear. A type of horror that you can't get in a Halloween movie because it's just a normal town you can run or drive away from. Even in a possession or supernatural film, you feel a sense of escapability as you can always try and flee the area. However, trapped in the vast darkness of space with nowhere to run or hide, Alien creates its own unique wave of horror and dread that washes over you. The plot of the film follows a mining crew aboard the ship the Nostromo, who after answering a distress signal bring back an extraterrestrial and otherworldly subject that begins tearing apart the unsuspecting crew one by one. Filled with excellent chase sequences filmed wonderfully by Ridley Scott, incredible practical effects that still hold up to this day, and simultaneously one of the most famous movie monsters ever in the Xenomorph, and one of the greatest heroines in any film ever with Sigourney Weaver's Ellen Ripley. Alien is just one of the greatest additions to the horror genre, and no other film has quite been able to capture the blend of sci-fi and horror as well as Ridley Scott did with his amazing piece of late 70s horror. This is a scenario where I try and put my bias aside for the greater good. Jokes aside, I do really enjoy The Conjuring. I think it's a really well-made, well-acted, and frankly strong addition to the horror genre. And while it would be super easy to put a film like Psycho, Jaws, or even one of the old Universal classic monster horror flicks like Frankenstein or The Invisible Man as my final recommendation, all films I probably enjoy more than The Conjuring, the reason I'm not choosing any of those is that sometimes you have to put aside your personal favorites, and since this is me recommending films for new horror fans, I didn't want this list to be all movies from the 70s and 80s. And since I firmly believe that new horror films are also pretty damn great, I went with quite possibly the most prominent horror film of the 2010s. Because this movie exploded onto the scene. Already a well-established filmmaker by this point with films like Saw and Insidious, James Wan crafted what would become the most popular horror film of the decade with The Conjuring. A story about a family moving into a new home and then supernatural events begin occurring is not a new concept by any stretch, but it's Wan's craftsmanship and the execution of the story that makes the film stand out. For starters, the film is way better shot than a vast majority of mainstream horror. Purposeful camera movements with clear intent in the framing and composition are a nice breath of fresh air. On top of that, the stereotypical and cliched paranormal investigator characters that often appear in these kinds of flicks are actually fleshed out and given a decent amount of screen time. Plus, Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga have excellent on-screen chemistry. And similar to Hereditary, the film does the due diligence in getting you invested in the characters and fleshing them out just enough without it bogging down the pace. Despite it being just a very well-made product, the film actually has some very solid and well-executed scares. One thing I appreciate about James Wan is that he does include jump scares in his movies, but they're usually well-orchestrated jump scares. Not fake out or loud noises or using ramped-up music to make you jump, but utilizing genuinely scary, unsettling, and creepy imagery in the jump scares that has you questioning what you just saw. It's a very effective trait that you find in a lot of his films. Even though I may consider this weaker than most of the other films on the list, again, the cultural impact and prominence of The Conjuring can't be overlooked. When this film was released, I was just starting high school and everyone was talking about it. Kids, teachers, it was everywhere. And since then, 11 years later, we've received several direct sequels and multiple spin-offs, and all of it because of how well received it was and how big of an impact James Wan original Conjuring film had. All in all, it's a really solid film that's very well made with a lot of passion and creativity behind the camera, as well as just being a genuinely frightening film at times. Honestly, if you're looking at modern horror in the last 10 to 15 years, there's a lot worse you could do, so I recommend checking out James Wan's The Conjuring. Well guys, I hope that this list doesn't make too many people mad. I already know, despite my reasoning, that people will probably be upset that The Conjuring made this list over so many classics, but hey, some modernity is needed for this type of video. Either way guys, I hope you liked the video. If you're new to horror and check some of these out, let me know your thoughts. If you're already a fan of the genre, let me know what you think of my choices. Also, leave your own list of the 10 essential horror movies that you'd recommend someone trying to get into horror. I'd love to hear what you guys have to think and what your picks are. And as always, if you guys liked the video, make sure to click the like button, subscribe to me if you want to hear more from me, and also click the little bell notification button so you get notified when I post new content. Make sure to check out my horror podcast as well, Scared Speechless. Every Monday, new episodes are released on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, so check us out. And as always, guys, I will see you on the next video.